Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here on another high-flying survey of planet, prison, meta-universe, Earth in my SR-72 CIA Lockheed SR-72 powered with count 'em, two double Pratt & Whitney jet engines with 18 feet diameter rockets, which when I hit the afterburners on this puppy, I can kick it up to Mach 6 to Mach 7. So I can cruise all day at 3,000 miles an hour. Now, what I forgot to mention, I do have to go down to 30,000 feet and refuel. Sometimes I drop down to 20,000 feet, where my KC-135 refueling planes kick me back up, and then I'm good to go for another 90 minutes. However, the higher I fly at this altitude, which is approximately 100,000 feet up, 19 miles above the surface of the Earth, I don't really consume that much fuel at this level. There's very little air resistance. So I'm kind of quasi-microgravity. I'm not technically in outer space. I'm pretty close to where we consider the beginning of outer space. It's approximately 19 miles up is where we call low Earth orbit, just above my head. All right, well anyway, having said that, today's video is going to be about connecting the dots and bringing in the concept of the CIA hiding in plain view and Hollywood mocking us. Because they're running a magic show, people. They're running a magic show. And the headquarters of Hollywood, as far as I'm concerned, is on Franklin Avenue, where Charlie Manson had an apartment for a few months, and Charles Watson had an apartment for a few months, and where Janis Joplin was put to sleep permanently on October 4th, 1970, next door to the Magic Castle. The Magic Castle. That's the center of the bullseye for Hollywood. The center of the bullseye for all things music was Frank Zappa's house at 2401 Laurel Canyon, atop the tippy top, at the corner of Lookout Mountain Drive and Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Harry Houdini lived on the east-south corner, and Frank Zappa lived at the northwest corner. So they were sort of kitty corner of Lookout Mountain Drive, which is where, you name it, the who's who, from Linda Ronstadt to Jerry Brown, the Jesuit-educated Jerry Brown, Governor Moonbeam. He lived on Lookout Mountain Drive. So did Michelle Phillips, John Phillips, Stephen Stills, Lord have mercy, Joni Mitchell. Steve McQueen lived down there. He didn't live on Lookout Mountain Drive, but he lived on one of the roads right off of it. And then you got the Disney Studios over there on Wonderland Avenue. Timothy Leary had a place on Wonderland Park Avenue. There's a Wonderland Park Avenue off of Wonderland Avenue. It's kind of sort of what you saw in Benedict Canyon, where Cielo Drive is off Cielo Drive, right? And we have that also near Laurel Canyon with the Natalie Wood compound, the gated compound that Cass Elliot moved into after Natalie Wood moved out. 7708 Woodrow Wilson Drive, which is off Woodrow Wilson Drive. In other words, it's the drive that's off the drive, making it impossible for tourists to figure out where the heck is this house located, right? They do that on purpose, people, because if they really wanted you to know where Sharon Tate was murdered, they'd just call it Sunbrook Drive. And you'd get on Benedict Canyon Drive, you'd make an immediate left-hand turn onto Angelo Drive. So I think it's your first left. And maybe it's your second left. I think the first left is what's called North Glen Dale, and so you don't turn there. You turn on Angelo Drive and just pursue that and stay on it until you see to your right Sunbrook Drive. It's a cul-de-sac, and just park anywhere along there and just look up, and that's where Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger were murdered, just right at the top of the little ice plant area there. If you don't know and you're confused, ask Oliver Stone. He knows, because he's been there before. Oliver Stone, JFK, Platoon, Wall Street, JFK, Putin interview, JFK, Ukrainian crisis. You're going to go to Oliver Stone to get your history, and your facts on the case, I don't think that's a good idea, because he's friends with Timothy Leary, who's a CIA, career LSD maven. Tune in, turn on, drop out. That's Oliver Stone's buddy. So I don't think I'd be taking advice from Timothy Leary's buddy, Oliver Stone. Anyway, today's I want to give you an example of hiding in plain view. I want to remind you that we're in a magic act, and the first rule of a cult is oath of secrecy. And in magic, that is that you don't tell the trick. You don't show the audience how you do the trick. You don't tell a friend how you do the trick. You keep your lips zipped. You zip it. It's called the oath of secrecy. All magicians take an oath of secrecy, or else they're not going to stick around in the magic business. And if you're going to work in Hollywood, zip it. If you're going to work in the clandestine services, along with William Colby and Richard Helms and Alan Dulles, zip it. Oath of secrecy, right? If you're going to be Oliver Stone and produce documentary, dramatized versions of a documentary, zip it, Oliver Stone. Don't be talking about Tom Pollock. Don't talk about your relationship with Mario Casar. Don't discuss Michael Arata. Don't talk about if you ran into Noam Bloom, the porn purveyor. Don't talk about that. I wouldn't recommend you talk about your connection with Terry Semmel over at Warner Brothers, formerly of Warner Brothers. Wouldn't mention Terry Semmel's name. Wouldn't do that, because that's all that's going to do is connect you up with Warner Brothers. It's going to connect you up with CBS, Columbia Pictures. It's going to connect you up, obviously, with MGM. It's going to connect you up with Universal, with Tom Pollock. I wouldn't mention any of those names in the public domain. I can do it, because, see, I'm not in the cult. I didn't take an oath of secrecy. So I have an auditing background, and I told Sean Stone, he didn't really get it. I told him when he uttered the words, "You got to follow the money," and I said to him, "You can't follow the money, but you can follow the bankers, and you can follow the directors, and you can follow the producers, and or the executive producers or the executive directors. You can follow them around, and that'll answer of where is the money going, because as long as people are getting paid and they know each other and they're in business relationships with each other, and they're going over to people's homes on St. Patrick's Day on a Sunday to a CIA crime scene for Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger, and you're going to the crime scene to go visit Timothy Leary, you're in a cult. There's no doubt about it. Cult rituals of obedience follow the oath of secrecy. So first there's an oath of secrecy, then there's an oath of obedience, then there sort of is an oath of poverty, because guess what? If you don't follow the first two rules, you'll be unemployed. No one's going to pay you any money in Hollywood or in banking or in the clandestine services. Plus, you might get whacked. You might actually be murdered. Kind of like Jose Menendez was, kind of like Abigail Folger was, kind of like Lino LaBianca, who was a private banker for the drug business for the CIA's operations in Los Angeles, kind of like he was, right? Kind of like Dr. Victor Oda got whacked along with half his family, his wife and two sons. They came back later and got one of his two daughters. So that's pretty much 85% of his family got murdered, plus his secretary. So I don't know what he did, but somebody must have violated some oaths, don't you think? I do. I think that there's oaths, and I think that the devil doesn't have a sense of humor. That's what I think. Anyway, I want to continue. My focus is that the Magic Castle, which is located on Franklin Avenue, right across the street from the Dolby Theater, where the Will Smith bitch slap of Chris Rock, who's a comedian, right? It was really funny, Chris, to see you not get slapped by Will Smith, an actor who's acting. It's about 2 blocks from the Church of Scientology Visitor Center, and that's across the street from the Roosevelt Hotel, and not that far from the Chateau Marmont Hotel, where allegedly Kirk Douglas might have raped Natalie Wood when she was 16 years old on Sunset Boulevard. It's not too far away from what we're talking about here, where the Magic Castle is, where the Dolby Theaters. But that's the epicenter for deception of Hollywood. That symbolizes the magic acts that Hollywood is all about. Hollywood is about sending you social engineering, applied linguistics messaging through music, through art, through film, through storytelling, through horror, through romance, through the magic of Hollywood, the Magic Kingdom, capturing your imagination so that they can capture your mind, capture the person, and essentially move you into an enslavement system so that you're really a slave. It's just that you're clueless to the fact that you're a slave. And that's why they want to move us to the, central bank digital currency social score control system, which is techno-enslavement, is what that is. It's more than techno-feudalism, it's techno-enslavement, because it's full spectrum enslavement, from travel to GPS tracking you, to surveilling you, to turning off your bank account when you don't behave, turning it back on when you do behave, but putting you in a real tight box, moving you from a 5,000 square foot home into a closet. That's techno-enslavement. Anyway, that's what they want to do, because that way they got these 5G towers and the satellites above for a reason. I know, I'm up here flying around observing all of these things. All right, here's some examples of Hollywood films that were produced I'm just going to go back to 1939, but I'm actually going to go 1 year earlier, 1938, where radio, of course, was in vogue, and CBS was the king of radio, and in New York. And a show was produced by Columbia Broadcasting System out of New York, and they hired John Houseman, who, of course, we all know that's not his real name. John Houseman's real name is Jacques Haussmann. He's a Romanian Jew. And in 1938, he was 36 years old. And he was named the producer of The War of the Worlds. And he cast Orson Welles because of his great voice, baritone voice tones. Orson Welles was a mere 23-year-old, and on October 30th, 1938, so we're coming up on an anniversary of sorts for the Orson Welles narration of The War of the Worlds, which they broadcast in the evening and scared the bejesus out of millions of New Yorkers who actually believed that alien spaceships landed across the Hudson River at a farm in New Jersey. And of course, the implication was that the aliens are going to enslave all of the New Yorkers because, hey, that's what aliens do, right? And, the last couple of years with COVID, if you ask me, that was War of the Worlds. That was just a redo of Orson Welles and John Housemann's narration of a simulated fake reality, right? So you create a boogeyman, which is in your mind, and then everyone's wearing face diapers, observing basically a satanic bank cult of face masking, which has a long history of being obedient. It's an oath. If you wear a face diaper, you're saying you're obedient and you're in the establishment. In other words, you respect authority. You don't question authority. You don't question the fact that the authority is probably lying to you. You just believe the lie. It's just a lot easier to go with the flow. It's called mass formation psychosis. It's called cognitive dissonance. And of course, I'm not interested in those things. It's creepy to me. So I'm going to question authority. I'm going to push back. I'm going to disobey. And I'm going to be a problem for the digital social scores. Right? Somebody's got to say no. So it might as well start here on my channel. All right. So we had the War of the Worlds. It was a psychological terror operation. It was a huge success, and as you can see, so was COVID. COVID was a grand success on a world scale. It was much larger than the Orson Welles War of the Worlds. But anyway, that was all pulled off on October 30th, 1938, and the usual suspects were involved. William S. Paley being the chairman of CBS, and he quickly becomes named, I think on the strength of how successful the War of the Worlds was in New York. William S. Paley was brought into the OSS, Office of Special Services, Office of Strategic Services, and flown to London, England to work with British intelligence on warfare propaganda psychological reporting, which eventually would swallow up Walter Cronkite would eventually get hired. Not right away. Walter Cronkite was working for UPI, United Press International, which is also a clandestine services propaganda. Read the cue card, because that's all Walter Cronkite was. He was a presenter of fake news. That's what he did. He didn't look into anything. He had no journalist credentials. He didn't graduate from a university. He just volunteered to go into the Army and got assigned to the UPI. And then eventually he was employed at Columbia Broadcasting System, where he hosted the CBS Evening News, which was a 30-minute fake news show. Anyway, it's about someone lying into a camera and have enough people believe the lies. Then you can get a job on television, because you're not going to produce your own content. They're going to type up the story, and they're going to tell you to act like you're sincere and act like you know what you're talking about. These people don't. They don't know. If you see them on television and they're talking, they have no idea what they're talking about. Okay? I'm not going to mention any names, but it's a long list of people that you recognize that are clueless. They have no idea. But they do have a nice home and they get paid good money, as long as they take an oath of obedience and they take an oath of secrecy and people watch, they can keep their job. So after we had the War of the Worlds, approximately a year later, we had Charlie Chan at Treasure Island. Charlie Chan was a murder mystery show with a kind of a Sherlock Holmes Asian, and this was done out of San Francisco specifically on purpose to celebrate the World's Fair, the World's Exposition, which was being hosted through San Francisco and Treasure Island, which is a military landfill created attachment to Yerba Buena Island, which eventually anchored the San Francisco Bay Bridge, which hadn't been constructed yet. So you have to take boats. It's a short ferry ride from the World Trade Center in San Francisco at the foot of Market Street and zipping on over to Treasure Island, where the World's Exposition and exhibits were, which was the model for Disneyland people. Walt Disney didn't cook up the idea for Disneyland. He just photocopied and pasted the World's Exposition fairs, which traveled around. He just made that a permanent location in Anaheim in Orange County. And he got Art Linkletter and Ronald Reagan to be the Grand Masters of Ceremonies to establish Disneyland in 1955. So this is 1939. This is specifically, we're talking about September 8th, 1939, Charlie Chan at Treasure Island. The reason I bring that up is they featured a killer who was targeting wealthy people in San Francisco and murdering them. And the murderer called himself Zodiac. Now that's important, because exactly 30 years later, the Zodiac murdered Paul Stein, a yellow cab driver, in Presidio Heights, adjacent to Presidio Army officer housing in San Francisco, where he wasn't a wealthy man, he was a cab driver. He's 29 years old, married, and he was shot in the left skull with a 9mm pistol at the corner of Washington Street and Cherry Street, just a few blocks from where Nancy Pelosi and her husband, Paul Pelosi, lived. Right. Because they lived in Presidio Heights before they moved to Pacific Heights, which is about a mile away. But this is right next to the Army base. And it's a nice neighborhood. It's in closer proximity to St. Ignatius Parish and, of course, University of San Francisco Jesuit University, Lone Mountain Campus, and, of course, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which at that time was home to Hunter S. Thompson, Timothy Leary, Paul Tate, Sharon Tate's father, was living in officer housing just a couple blocks from where the Zodiac murdered Paul Stein, right? Michael Aquino, he lived in there. I'm not sure if he lived in there on that date. It's possible that he could have. He had finished up his studies at University of California, Santa Barbara, so he was available. He could have been there. I think he was about 23 years old at the time of the Paul Stein murder. And of course, let's not forget Louis Jolan West, a CIA MK Ultra psychiatrist, is living in close proximity to this address and working with Abigail Folger's mother in Haight-Ashbury, near University of San Francisco, near St. Ignatius Parish, near St. Agnes Elementary School. And he's working with Bill Graham, whose real name is Wolf Grudjanka, who promotes free concerts. I said free concerts, but somehow magically makes a salary. So I'm assuming Abigail Folger's mother takes care of that, right? And that's where Jim Jones of People's Temple, he's reports in there too. People's Temple opens their first church in San Francisco at 1849 Geary Boulevard, right next door to Bill Graham's Fillmore Auditorium. They share a wall. So you basically take care of Wolf Grudjanka's free concerts and entertaining, anti-war protesters using Columbia Records and Warner Brothers labels talent, like Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Grateful Dead, using groups like the Jefferson Airplane, formerly known as the Great Society with Grace Slick. And you basically set up two buildings side by side, which was the Scottish Rites Temple was buttressed up against the George Sullivan owned Fillmore Auditorium. But of course, George Sullivan had a mysterious suicide murder on August 1st, 1967, the Summer of Love. George Sullivan got shot in the head, and so he didn't have any children. So I guess that meant that Bill Graham could just use his building, which he did. That was all going on in San Francisco. But anyway, what I wanted to tell you is that Charlie Chan telegraphed that move 30 years in advance. The CIA told you when it was the OSS. The OSS told you that there's going to be the murder of people in San Francisco, and they told you that on after September 8th, 1939, they told you there'd be a Zodiac killer operating in San Francisco. And 30 years later, actually on October 11th, so let's call it 30 years and 13 days. 30 years and 13 days later, there's a Zodiac killing in Presidio Heights, San Francisco. 30 years and 13 days after Charlie Chan at the Treasure Island, we have a do-over. Then, in 1941, Orson Welles, just a few years after he does that War of the Worlds, he, of course, stars and directs Citizen Kane. And that's produced by RKO Studios, which, by the way, that was in 1941 when RKO Studios purchased the Cielo Drive terraced properties. They bought two lots on the hillside, and then they bulldozed and excavated the dirt to create two terraces, two benches on Cielo Drive, Benedict Canyon, where they built two, not one. They built two homes. They actually built four. They built two main homes and two pool houses. So they built four homes and two swimming pools at 10048 Cielo and 10050 Cielo, where Sharon Tate eventually got murdered. But they're right on top of each other. There's 150 feet of elevation difference. And they're duplicates. They're identical twins. The upper home where Sharon Tate was murdered, that was referred to as the Love House. RKO Studios built that house in 1942, 43, 44. They bought the house 10 days before Pearl Harbor in 1941, at the time that they were producing Citizen Kane. At the time Citizen Kane is going to be released, RKO is purchasing raw land in Benedict Canyon, which later becomes the Love House, and then the twin, the evil twin, Doppelganger twin house, which is a perfect staging house if you want to conduct porn activities, or you want to conduct clandestine spy parties, or you want to bayonet murder 5 people to death. I would recommend that you do it at the staging house below, where they have more showers and they have a swimming pool. And then in a couple years later, and over the next 10 years, they built an additional 4 houses, so that you had 4 houses and they added 4 more houses. Now you're up to 8 houses when you add Sunbrook Drive and Angelo Drive, which you can only access from Sunbrook Drive. So essentially, got 4 houses on off Angelo on Sunbrook Drive, and then you have 4 houses that are technically on Cielo Drive, although one is really Bella. If you're staying with me, so that's 8 homes. That's like 20 showers. So you've got capability of having a big party or a big murder. And also you can put Timothy Leary into one of those homes and send Oliver Stone over there to visit him when he's getting ready to do his big farewell tour from his prostate cancer, which is a true story. Then after we had Citizen Kane, I'm going to fast forward, we had 3 Days of the Condor. That was released by Paramount Pictures in 1975. And in that movie, the CIA wanted to bring up 2 things. One was a true story about using literary historical societies as cover for CIA clandestine coded messages. There were 7 employees, staff members of the American Literary Historical Society in New York City, right next door to Central Park. And it turns out that's where Abigail Folger was assigned, only it wasn't called the American Literary Historic Society. It was called the Columbia University Gotham Book Mart. And there, Abigail Folger was introduced to Roman Polanski, Jerzy Kaczynski, and Wojtek Frykowski, which would become her control agent. Wojtek Frykowski, twice divorced, older man who would, be some muscle for her because she's going to be handling cash because she's going to be a private banker. After having been educated at Radcliffe and Harvard universities, she's going into banking with no formal banking experience. But it's not that complicated. It's basically just paying people, and once they agree to do what they're supposed to do, then they get paid. But she's a young woman, so she needs some backup to make sure. Usually the banker jobs are handled by men, but in the case of Abigail, her mother was very good at it. And I think that Ines Mejia was the reason that Abby got her job. When I say Abby, she went by Gibby. Abigail. Then, just before the 3 Days of the Condor, you remember in the 1960s, we had Rosemary's Baby. That actually came out on June 12th, 1968. That was a concept where the devil impregnates a 21-year-old Mia Farrow. That was done at the Dakota. The Dakota, where John Lennon was assassinated in 1980. In December 1980, John Lennon got murdered. That was where Rosemary's Baby was produced. And again by Paramount Pictures and directed by Roman Polanski, starring John Cassavetes, who's a cuckold husband and who makes a deal with the devil in exchange for a Hollywood career, which is a true theme in Hollywood. And then you have Mia Farrow, who's 21, who's married to Frank Sinatra at the time, who's much older. He's in his 40s, married to a 21-year-old Mia Farrow, and she has the devil's baby. Then a few years later, we have The Godfather, which stars Marlon Brando and, the who's who. We've got James Caan, and you got Al Pacino as Michael Corleone, Robert Duvall, who's fresh out of his THX 1138 with Donald Pleasance, being directed by George Lucas and produced by Francis Ford Coppola in 1969-70. Robert Duvall and Donald Pleasance worked for Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers is the bank that came up with the money. Francis Ford Coppola didn't come up with the money. George Lucas is 25 years old. Francis Ford Coppola was only 29 years old when he's working with Donald Pleasance, The Church of Synanon, and Robert Duvall. So somebody's got to pay some bills. Somebody's got to open up the Lawrence Livermore Weapons Lab, open up the Posey Tube in Alameda to go to the Naval Air Base. Someone's got to get permission from Bechtel, the general contractor for the Bay Area Transit Transbay Tube. Someone's got to get permission to get Church of Scientology bald-headed, cue-ball head actors to work in their dystopian film, which is like COVID-1. Anyway, then we had the 3 Days of the Condor, where Robert Redford pretends to be Joe Turner, who's a brainiac, literary person for the CIA, and they create this illusion that there's a rogue element of the CIA operating within the CIA. That's false. There is no rogue element. The CIA is compartmentalized like a submarine, like a bank. like a military organization, and there are no rogue elements. It's impossible. Banks don't finance rogue elements. They only finance the operations that they approve, and they only finance, it's a pay-as-you-go program. So they'll always be ready to cut you off if you don't do what you say. But they also, in the movie 3 Days of the Condor, they tell you in plain view that they use bookstores or book literary societies to mask and conceal CIA operatives, which Robert Redford played a CIA employee named Joe Turner, which is much the same as Abigail Folger pretending to be a book salesperson at the Columbia Gotham Book Mart. It's no different. Or working with Jerzy Kosinski, who becomes a Hollywood scriptwriter for being there with Peter Sellers. Godfather was a film about the 5 families of New York, 5 organized crime families, which, if you don't get the premise of that movie, was when the drug business was coming into New York, and there was clearly a movement into drugs, the white powder, meaning heroin. And you remember that Don Corleone, Vito Corleone, was opposed to drugs. So they tried to whack him. They attempted to murder and assassinate Vito Corleone, kind of sort of like they did with Jose Menendez when they moved him into the porn industry. So I don't know if Jose Menendez was opposed to porn. I can't believe he would be, because that was what was providing most of his salary and his bonus. So I would not believe that Jose Menendez was opposed to pornography. That's how he's going to make $1.3 million a year and have a beautiful 14-acre ranch in Calabasas with a 9,000 square foot brand new remodeled home with a swimming pool. He's not going to get that unless he's in the porn industry. So I got to believe he was on board with the porn, but they still whacked him anyway. They did it in Beverly Hills. They could have killed him in Calabasas, where he spent most of his time, but they didn't. They killed him in Beverly Hills. It's the same thing what they do with Sharon Tate. She spent no time at that home. Abigail Folger spent no time at that home. Tom Coomer Jay Sebring spent no time in that home, but they lure him in to kill him. Lino LaBianca spent little time in his mother's home. I mean, he grew up there as a little kid, but he's living in the Walt Disney Mansion. But he sold it, so it's not available anymore. He's buying a ranch in North San Diego, but that deal hasn't closed. So he's just temporarily staying at his mother's house. But that's where they whacked him, a place that he didn't live. They do that a lot. So the message that most people didn't get in The Godfather was that the CIA is in the drug business. And when they want to pursue the 5 families in New York and do banking activity and promote the distribution of drugs, they're not kidding around. They're serious. So anybody that resists that's going to get whacked or neutralized, which is what happened when Vito Corleone was shot multiple times at the marketplace, at the fresh produce market. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts today, and that the people that are involved, like names like Orson Welles. Let me just tell you that Natalie Wood, whose real name was Natasha Natasha Kasarenko is Natalie Wood's. Her very first speaking role in film was in 1946, where she starred next to Orson Welles. Okay? So Orson Welles was, much older. Natalie Wood, renamed, was 8 years old when she starred and spoke in film for Hollywood with Orson Welles. Natalie Wood, age 8. Okay? And Orson Welles, this was in 1946. So Orson Welles would be approximately 31 years old. So Orson Welles is 31 and Natalie Wood is age 8. And this was the first film that Natalie Wood spoke words. And the reason I bring that up is that Sharon Tate's last film that she starred as her 7-year contract with MGM was expiring was also with Orson Welles, where she starred in Rome, Italy in 13 Chairs, aka 12 Plus 1. And this is Sharon Tate's last film before she gets bayoneted 16 times to death. She stars with Orson Welles. So Orson Welles is like a cradle to grave actor. He features Natalie Wood at age 8, who goes on to be murdered, right, in 1981, right? at Santa Catalina Island. That's right, I said Santa Catalina Island, where Abigail Folger went to boarding school, Santa Catalina Academy, where Dakota Johnson went to Santa Catalina Academy, 50 Shades of Grey, where Patricia Hearst, who was a kidnap victim for the CIA, William Randolph Hearst, which is what Citizen Kane was based on, her grandfather. Patricia Hearst went to the Santa Catalina Academy, where Victor Otis' two daughters attended Santa Catalina Academy, where Natalie Wood was murdered in the bay at Santa Catalina Island, and they took a boat ride out of Marina del Rey, where Dennis Wilson was murdered 2 years later in 1983 in Marina del Rey, where the Menendez boys rented the penthouse of the apartment right there where Dennis Wilson mysteriously died, the Marina Club penthouse. Right. It's a lot of cult rituals. I'll give you some other examples. Robert Kennedy coming out to California for the primary to get the nomination to run for president against Richard Nixon. And he comes out and he wins the primary, and they want him to come to the Ambassador Hotel to give his victory speech, but he doesn't want to go. And he's being kept at the Malibu gated colony, right, at John Frankenheimer's house. And then John Frankenheimer is told to drive Robert Kennedy and his wife Ethel to the Ambassador Hotel. And he gets his Rolls-Royce Silver Thundercloud and drives Robert Kennedy right past Charlie Manson, who's staying at the Will Rogers, who's a CBS radio political satirist, Will Rogers, who died in a mysterious plane crash in 1935. And they go right past Will Rogers' hunting lodge where Charlie Manson is living, in June 1968. In June 1960, I'd say Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel and Mary Brunner were there, but they weren't there. They were actually with Jim Jones in Ukiah in June 1968, when Robert Kennedy was driven to his death by John Frankenheimer, the director of The Manchurian Candidate. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Mary Brunner, the mother of Charlie Manson's baby, they are in Mendocino County. They're 5-6 hours north. They're more than that. They're 13 hours north. So they're definitely not on Sunset Boulevard, but Robert Kennedy is. And look, there's no way you drive a presidential candidate in a Rolls Royce and draw lots of targeting, attention to yourself unless you were told to do that. So that's a cult ritual of obedience. That is analogous to Oliver Stone going to visit Timothy Leary in the last 2 months of his life at the Sharon Tate murder scene. I mean, of all places, couldn't he visit him down on Sunset Boulevard? Couldn't they meet at the Friars Club, with Milton Berle, who I met at the Friars Club at Century City? Couldn't they meet there? Or couldn't they meet at the Playboy Mansion in Holmby Hills, right? Why do they have to meet at the Sharon Tate murder scene? Why is that the location that Oliver Stone is required to go to give a get well card to Timothy Leary, the LSD maven? Tune in, turn on, drop out. That's a cult ritual. John Frankenheimer driving Robert Kennedy to his assassination. That's a cult ritual of obedience. Visiting Timothy Leary during his last couple of months. That's a cult ritual of obedience. The Godfather disagreeing to go into the drug business. That's disobedience. So he gets whacked. Sharon Tate getting pregnant, refusing to get an abortion, refusing to renew her 7-year contract with MGM. That's disobedient. She gets whacked. Abigail Folger spent 18 months as a private banker. She didn't like it. She's seen a psychologist down the hill in Beverly Hills, just like Eric Menendez was required by the court as part of his probation from his burglary charges up at Calabasas. He had to see a psychiatrist, and they maneuvered him into a Beverly Hills psychologist, which doesn't really make sense. They should have had a psychologist up by, Encino or Sherman Oaks. I mean, there's plenty of psychologists up there. Why do we have to go down to Beverly Hills? He's going to Calabasas High School. He's not going to Beverly Hills High School like Dominic Dunn will tell you. I mean, he's not telling the truth. So you got William Paley, you got Walt Disney, you got Roy Disney, Jeffrey Bezos. he he went to Princeton, and then he went to work at Bankers Trust Company in New York, which is where William Colby's second wife worked at Bankers Trust Company in New York. And they have a life insurance division. And do you know that they sold $10 million of the $15 million of life insurance for Jose Menendez was issued by Bankers Trust Company in New York through their life insurance division? Yeah. So I got a CIA bank vault issuing life insurance to a key employee of the porn industry, which is Jose Menendez, and it pays out $15 million. $5 million was with Credit Lyonnais, a French bank insurance company, and $10 million, or 2/3 of the 15, came out of New York using reinsurance, and that's where William Colby, the CI director's second wife, worked, and that's where Jeffrey Bezos worked before he was transferred to a hedge fund to meet his new wife, who was the secretary there, who also went to Princeton, Mackenzie Scott, who grew up in the San Francisco area. And what do you know? That's his adult supervision, I guess, was Mackenzie. Then they get divorced, but they all got together through the investment business. I don't think anybody sat down and conjured up the idea of selling books on the internet. I don't think I mean, I know they're interested in who reads books because they want to surveil the heck out of people who read books and think. I get that, but you now know that Amazon is in every business, and they've taken over the grocery business with Whole Foods. And by the way, Jeffrey Bezos, that's not his real name. His real name is Jorgensen, and his real father's name Jorgensen. And Bezos is a Cuban person. You know, like Jose Menendez was Cuban. Remember? Jose Enrique Menendez escaped at age 16 from Havana, Cuba. You know, remember the Maine? A United States naval ship sunk in the harbor of Havana. And William Randolph Hearst, which Citizen Kane and Orson Welles based that film on William Randolph Hearst's life. And he's the one who's quoted as saying, "You provide the photographs, I'll provide the war." William Randolph Hearst, yellow journalism. To create a fake false flag attack, except real people died in the explosion of the USS Maine in the harbor. It killed hundreds of Navy seamen. But anyway, that was the basis for a 4-month war with Spain. The Spanish-American War was started in Cuba, where Jose Menendez is from, where Jeff Bezos' father is from, who goes on to become the fake leader of Amazon. There's so many connections here, but I'm telling you, it's a cult. It's banking, it's Hollywood, it's magic, it's deception, and the cults overlap into like a centralized cult. But all the cults share secrecy oath, obedience oath. It appears that they have a human sacrifice oath, and they have to give up their children, and they have to marry within the society, because that's what Jeff Bezos did, and that's what Oliver Stone did, and that's what just go down the list. I mean, they all do that. That's what Sharon Tate had to do. She didn't have a real marriage. She had a fake marriage to a Polish British intelligence agent named Roman Polanski. And it's the same with Jerzy Kaczynski. He had a much older woman that he married who was an heiress of the steel industry, Jerzy Kaczynski, and he got murdered with a plastic bag over his head, suicided. All right, well, that's it for today. I just wanted to tell you that we got a lot of connections here with respect to Hollywood, banking, clandestine services, and life insurance, and offices in close proximity to the Magic Castle, murders. I mean, we must have a dozen murders within walking distance of the Dolby Theater where the Will Smith, Chris Rock bitch slap happened. They were lucky that was a simulated bitch slap, because they could have actually done an actual murder, since we've had so many homicides in that neighborhood. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Hit the like or subscribe. Ciao.